I want to give a shout out to my friends at UDeal. It is a blockchain startup, which is really big in Korea. And they're doing some really great things. And basically building a whole environment on the blockchain. UDeal, you can check them out. Met them actually in the when I was doing my guest speaking in Tokyo at the blockchain conference. Can't remember the name of it. It was the I have to look on my LinkedIn profile. But I was doing a keynote up there talking about the why of the blockchain, why it exists, what's going on with our planet, what's the underlining reason why it is important. And it comes down to a little bit of code called CAGR. CAGR ultimately was invented as a mechanism for convincing individuals to invest in the Industrial Revolution back during the first estate, which was steam. You had all these wealthy landowners, and you wanted them to get them into investing into steam engines. And compounded annual growth rate was a mechanism for getting folks to invest. And it would go further back from there. I'm sure it was the Indian trade and everything else. There is really no history of CAGR. CAGR may go back as far as the Roman Empire, for all I know. When was this equation to measure growth as a mechanism for ROI, return on investment, valuation? Our entire society, from our credit score to Wall Street, to our corporations, to Silicon Valley, everything, this single one global experiment we call the global economy, is all built on CAGR. Now, in 2010, when Occupy Wall Street was happening, I was living here in the heartland of Zen Buddhism, near Eiheiji, where Japanese Zen Buddhism was happening, and I had been spending a lot of time meditating on the startup. What is a startup? What is the, what are the problems of a startup? And everything, there's no clear definition of a startup. Depends on who you talk to. I've got talks on that. It's one of the first things I discovered back in 2009 is, as Plato would tell you, define a startup. And when Occupy Wall Street was happening, I was working on a very important component of the Open Innovation Framework, which back then I called the Open Startup Incubator, right? As a way to launch startups. Foundups was still kind of in the realm of CAGR. But when Occupy Wall Street happened, it all of a sudden put my focus on the work that I'd done, and I realized that it isn't the corporations that's the problem. They're an outcome of this thing. I didn't know what this thing was, actually, back in 2010. I didn't know it was CAGR. I didn't define that until a year later, right? But I knew the underlining thing that drove everything was built on this thing, this metric, right? And I went in search for this metric. And eventually I identified it as CAGR, compounded annual growth rate, or proof of growth, which leads to ROI. Our entire blockchain, our credit score, everything is built on CAGR. How well you interact with CAGR is your credit score. Are you a good person that pays back into the system on time and everything else? You have a high, CAGR score, right? Credit score, CAGR score, same thing. Think CAGR, credit. Are you someone who basically doesn't believe in the system and ultimately rejects the system and takes advantage of the system whenever possible? Someone like me. I have a low credit score. CAGR score. I'm like, fuck you, banks. Give me money. I'm going to take it. And I'm not going to pay you back because I don't believe in your system. Thank you. So every 10 years, I build up my credit score and I take out loans and I don't pay them back. Citibank. If you're getting my money, no, you don't get my money. So there's lots of me out there, and we take advantage of the system. And the system, after 10 years, forgets about us, gives our credit back, and repeat the cycle again. There's a confession. So I want you to imagine now, instead of a world built on CAGR, compounded annual growth rate, which growth leads to ROI. A good example of that is actually Amazon. Amazon went 3 years, so did PayPal, so did all these corporations. There is what's known as the chasm. And if you do not have access to closed capital networks, it is very hard to cross the chasm. This is one of the big secrets of a startup, the chasm. It happens in the early adoption phase of startups. And if you can keep throwing money, and the VCs, these big VCs know this game, right? You basically can push through to the customer adoption and get to the early majority, which is the, after the 13% is 2.5%, 13%. And then at the end of that, when you get to that 16% market adoption, right, you've crossed the chasm. And at that 16% is actually where the early majority starts. And Bezos and the investors behind Amazon, and there's so many others, Facebook, Twitter, there's so many, Cisco, all these major corporations all went through this crossing the chasm. And they had access to closed capital networks that allowed them to push through. Well, if you don't have access to those closed capital networks, guess what? You're going to be, you're going to fail. And 75% of VC-backed startups actually fail. They don't have the access, they don't have the funding to maintain this support. And they, some startups will last for, very long periods of time. But ultimately, they'll fail because eventually those investors will give up. And there's a lot of abnormalities, or a lot of things that may come up, new technologies and everything else that may come up and disrupt your initial idea. So what you imagine instead, though, instead of having a credit score built on CAGR, you have one built on CABR, compounded annual benefit rate. Imagine if your measure as an individual on society, you had a score, and this score would actually give you access to funds held in autonomous hedge funds called Danos. Think of them as a hedge fund, right? Or a bank, right? Autonomous banks that exist purely on the blockchain are entirely managed by code, right? And the code is evaluating you as a CABR participant, right? And CABR is measured by asking 3 simple, intangible questions, right? Number 1, how are you impacting the planet as an individual, right? How are you as an individual? What kind of work you do? What do you do, how are you? What kind of projects you're involved in, so on? What kind of food do you eat? Everything, right? This little noodle, I called back in 2010, called the Noodle, is this little algorithm, this little bot that watches everything you do. It's the same thing. You're being watched all the time by Google, by Facebook, all these algorithms that are watching you, right? But they're not open, they're not beneficial. They are a form of AI. So open beneficial AI is a new name for the Noodle. Obey because it obeys you, not some corporation, not some entity. It obeys you, and it protects you, and it's there for you, okay? And you have full control of what information is taken, kind of like looking at your spam email. So Obey ultimately will be gathering and crunching all this information and pushing it and determining how what your CABR score, what your beneficial credit score is, right? B credit. Just came up with a new term, B credit. And your B credit score, right, beneficial credit, ultimately will impact loans and everything else you will get that you'll pay back to the system. Imagine projects that you work on. Ultimately, the project would have a CABR score. Who else is involved, right, with you? What have they accomplished before? So everything will have this B credit score, which is all built on CAGR. And the second thing that it asks is, how is it what you're doing impacting the living system? So one is, how are you benefiting the planet? How is what you're doing impacting the living systems? And I'll explain that to you. For example, are you planting a salad garden? Are you, how are you volunteering? What sort of actions? What sort of things are you doing? The living systems of the world. You know, we're projected to lose 90% of all insects. 90% of all insects are projected to die in the next 50 years. 90%, right? 70% of all species are projected to go in the next 30 years, right? Ridiculous, just ridiculous numbers. And we have to become stewards. We're self-actualized individuals, and we must become stewards of the living systems. So every garden needs to be a kind of zoo. Every community needs to, encourage bees and everything else. We need to stand up and speak out against pesticides, right? We need to develop permaculture methods for agriculture that helps the living systems, and so on and so on and so on. And finally, share. How are you sharing your wealth, your benefit with others, your knowledge with others? Okay, do you make educational videos? Do you talk about the problem? Right? Sharing. Sharing ultimately will come down to UBIs, universal basic incomes, will come out of Danos and CABR. You can think of free education, all the different things that every Democrat is ultimately vying for and saying taxes should pay for, aren't going to come from taxes. They're going to come from a new kind of entity that now can exist because of the blockchain, because of OIF, the Open Innovation Framework, built on what I call the underlining Bitcoin protocol back in 2011, that you simply call the blockchain today. These new entities ultimately can't be stopped. That's the beautiful thing. Every corporation on Wall Street, every corporation on the planet, when I say corporation, I'm talking about public corporations, are all walking dead and will be replaced by corporations that you become a stakeholder of, simply by participating and interacting with that entity. So I want you to imagine, by simply signing up to Facebook, you get to vote on the annual meetings and everything else, just like you can in democracy, right? Just as you can for the President of the United States. But unlike the President of the United States that is actually decided by delegates, delegates are gone. Board of directors, you're not voting for the board of directors to make the decisions. That's the delegate system. You're actually voting for the system. That's the beautiful thing, and that's what's coming. And that's all built on proof of benefit, or CAGR. CABR, dyslexic.